Let's face it, folks are still getting their 2019 sea legs. The new year is merely 4 days old, and already the president has said a lot. But it was something he said on Wednesday that is getting a lot of attention, and not just because his version of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is completely wrong and attempts to rewrite history.
The reason Russia was in Afghanistan was because terrorists were going into Russia. They were right to be there. The problem is it was a tough fight. And literally, they went bankrupt. They went into being called Russia again, as opposed to the Soviet Union. You know, a lot of these places you're reading about now are no longer part of Russia because of Afghanistan.
Today, the normally Trump-friendly Wall Street Journal weighed in, and we quote, "We cannot recall a more absurd misstatement of history by an American president. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan with 3 divisions in December 1979 to prop up a fellow communist government. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was a defining event in the Cold War, making clear to all serious people the reality of the communist Kremlin's threat. Mr. Trump's cracked history can't alter that reality." Indeed, several people have noted a piece from Jonathan Chait of the New York Magazine, who writes, quote, "The Russian government is moving an official resolution," this is present day, "defending the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the approval scheduled to take place next month. Russians have previously called the invasion a tragic error, but Putin's regime, which regards the collapse of the Soviet Union as a world historical tragedy, is systematically rehabilitating various Soviet crimes." Chait linked to this op-ed from Russian dissident Vladimir Kara-Murza, who wrote about the resolution just last month. Well, with us for more tonight, General Barry McCaffrey, former battlefield commander in the Gulf War, retired U.S. Army 4-star general, a veteran of the Cold War and a couple of hot ones. He is a decorated veteran of combat as well. And with us tonight also Frank Figliuzzi, former FBI assistant director for counterintelligence, who in the past has worked for one Robert Mueller. General, short and sweet, first question to you. Will you please tell folks the real history?
Well, it's an astonishing assertion by the president. It sounds as if the talking points are written by the GRU. December 1979, the Soviets went into Afghanistan under the Brezhnev doctrine to take a socialist-friendly government and keep them in power. They brutalized the country. They were there for a decade. They took 50,000 killed and wounded. They killed a couple of million Afghan civilians. They drove 4 million Afghans into exile in Iran and Pakistan. It was a tragic operation from the start. It had nothing to do with terrorism in the Soviet Union. I think he must have grabbed pieces of history, and he's thinking of Chechnya or whatever. But this is a truly astonishing ignorance statement by the president.
General, it was so scarring. I know you know this is the case. It's hard to visit Afghanistan and not come face to face with the shards of the old Soviet military. You'll see a tank track. You'll see pieces of artillery. It litters the countryside.
Yeah, no, it was a disaster for the Soviet Union. A bunch of 18-year-old drafty boys fighting these, nationalist, patriotic Afghans who were basically responding to communism as an atheistic, affront to Islam. It's hard to imagine what the president was thinking of when he made this assertion. There's certainly no comparability at all between the Soviet experience in Afghanistan, which was stamped the civilian population into the ground, and the attempt by the NATO allies and much of the world community to support putting Afghanistan back together. I think that must be his purpose, to delegitimize what we're now doing in Afghanistan, given the fact he tweeted out this unilateral, we're going to cut our troop presence in half in Afghanistan, which I might add now essentially ends the likelihood of a diplomatic initiative to end the war.
Frank, you and I always talk about things that take place in plain sight. I'm just a civilian. I always think the feds are operating at a higher level. But the president says this on television, his words. Are you telling me the feds will stop, rewind, and take notice because he's parroting talking points that are limited to the closest circle around Putin?
Certainly the counterintelligence investigation that, if you recall, was the impetus for this entire special counsel. The counterintelligence side is going to take a look at why it is our president is siding with the communist regime, claiming that the Russians were, quote, right to go into Afghanistan. They're going to want to know the reasoning behind that and where it's coming from. Now, General McCaffrey has suggested a fairly benign reason, which is he's trying to cover his tracks as to why we're pulling troops out of Afghanistan. But the FBI is going to look at it even more deeply to say, look, there are a couple of other options. Once you set aside incompetence and inability to understand history and layer nuances and facts and conflating the rise of the Taliban and Osama bin Laden with Russia's presence, once you get rid of that, there's another option, which is that the president has deliberately chosen to regurgitate the Putin line, the Russian line on this, because he somehow needs to paint Russia in the most favorable light. And why is that? And we need to help understand whether that's because it serves his agenda to appease Russia, to say to them, you may have compromised me, we may have a problem here, but I'm on your side. And look, while this sounds like conjecture to many people, this is what counterintelligence agents do for a living. And when you combine it with the facts coming out of the special counsel inquiry, you've got to assume that Mueller's going to look at this. What is the motivation to make a comment that simply paints Russia in the most favorable light? And that's what counterintelligence is about.
And Frank, also in your bailiwick, the question we asked rhetorically at the top of the broadcast, what does it mean for the Russia effort for the president when you hear that Mueller's grand jury has been extended for 6 months, time they don't necessarily have to use, but time they needed to reserve?
Well, I'm going to state the obvious. It means this thing's far from over, and it means there's more indictments coming. Grand juries sit, Brian, for a number of reasons, but one of them that we really care deeply about is to issue indictments. So there's more coming. There's more people on the radar screen of the Mueller inquiry, and this thing's not over yet.